the safeguard mechanism reforms are part of a much wider suite of policy initiatives by our federal government in the last 10 months, and with a lot more still to come. So I would emphasise safeguard mechanism, it might be a key, or it is a key policy reform in its own right, but it's part of a suite of policies, starting with the move for 43% reduction by 2030, the Climate Act, the $15 billion National Reconstruction Fund, the 82% renewables by 2030, the methane pledge, and a number of other things. So at the end of the day, we're seeing momentum building. It's gone from a standing start, or in reverse, in fact, to very positive. We've still got a long way to go. But to me, the safeguard mechanism is a key policy reform, and we've got to make sure that we get progress, not perfection here. So getting it in is a really important step, in my view.
And, you know, who does the safeguard mechanism apply to?
Yes, the safeguard mechanism applies to 215 facilities, the 215 largest carbon emitting facilities in Australia. So they're industrial facilities, but more than half of those facilities are fossil fuel production. And so that's worth bearing in mind. And obviously that's a key point that the Greens and Adam Bandt have been making very, very clearly. But this is about the 215 largest emitting facilities. It is only scope 1 emissions, so direct emissions from the facility. And I might just emphasize why I stress that, because for context, scope 2 is the indirect emissions relating to production. Say, for example, the emissions relating to the generation of electricity off-site that is then used in the facility. And then scope 3 is the emissions that relate to the use of the product. So for a fossil fuel firm exporting LNG or coal, we're talking about exported emissions generated in the country receiving our exports, such as Japan, when they combust the product. So I make that digression because we are very much focused here on scope 1. And so I think we absolutely need to deal with the elephant in the room, scope 3. But when you have a policy in front of us that's relating to scope 1, let's focus on the target and then have a separate conversation about scope 3. And I'm sure we can come back to that.
Excellent. And then lastly, you know, why and how is it being reformed?
So it's being reformed so it actually has credibility. At the end of the day, it's been in place and it's done absolutely nothing. In fact, industrial emissions have been going up every year, not down. And obviously, the idea is we actually drive emissions down permanently at speed and scale. Hopefully, we get to alignment with the science. So the reforms involve bringing in measuring all of the emissions on those 215 facilities and then reducing their collective emissions by 7 million tonnes per annum. And I'll just stress that on the maths for a minute. I have a finance background, but so bear with me. But the maths to me is really important. 7 million tonnes per annum is a 4.9% reduction in year 1, but it's 7 million tonnes each and every year through to 2030. So the cumulative reduction is actually 5.8% compound reduction over the next 7 years. So 5.8% is a significant number, so long as it obviously is matched with integrity. And so when you're talking about a significant reduction, 7 million tonnes over 7 years, so by 2030, we're talking about a cumulative 49 million tonnes of reduction from these existing facilities. So sizable action from one of the largest sectors in Australia.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Tim, for that outline. I'll cover then some sort of high-level sort of aspects too, a bit about the politics, and then we'll and sort of my position, and then we'll go into some of the questions around that we've received around carbon credits, about new entrants, and about you know, emission projections and broader decarbonisation plans. You know, so first off, on what are the conflicting positions in Parliament? I think Tim gave a bit of a taste of it. So the Labor Party is pursuing the safeguard mechanism, and the overarching delivery of the safeguard mechanism, their goal is for the industrial sector, for the emitters that are being covered by this mechanism, the those 215 emitters, that they will all have to reduce their emissions by 43% by 2030. So it is consistent with their 2030 target. That said, all those industrial parties, companies and plants that are too small to be part of the safeguard mechanism do not have any obligations to reduce emissions by 2030. So it is quite a narrow, it's quite narrow in the sense that and I guess it's also quite targeted in the sense it is focused at the biggest emitters. So that's Labor's position is broadly that this is the position. They have tried to take what they would describe as a sector agnostic approach. So they are not, when in the sort of legislation and in the regulation, they're not trying to make different rules for coal and gas versus cement and other companies that are covered by the safeguard mechanism. They're just trying to say everybody has to achieve a similar kind of reduction in emissions. To touch on the different positions across the Parliament, so the LNP has, I think, effectively dialed themselves out of this discussion. They have said, that they're not going to support it, despite this being the policy framework that they originally designed themselves. And I think this is in real contrast to business and people like the Business Council of Australia who are saying, we need this so business has certainty so it can make the right investments. And so, the LNP has, it's really pursuing, I think, a very unconstructive approach that isn't even aligned with major businesses. Secondly, the Greens, their greatest concern, I think, and, is shared by, many in the crossbench, is a concern about sort of new coal and gas, and also about the potential to blow the emissions budget, and also by new entrants, so new companies who come into the safeguard, big companies that or big facilities that get drawn into the safeguard mechanism, and how will they be accounted for, and how to make sure that we reduce emissions successfully, for all those companies. The Greens have a position about no new coal and gas, and so that is partly what they're considering, how they could drive that within the safeguard mechanism, or through other sort of legislation options through Parliament. And the crossbench, I think, is working, I think, very constructively with the government, with the Greens, and with each other, both across the Senate and the House, to look at how can we make the legislation better. And certainly, my position is it is absolutely critical that we get the safeguard mechanism doing what it was intended to do, which is driving down industrial emissions. I support broadly, the government's sort of trajectory in terms of emissions reductions. I'd like them to go, a bit faster, but I actually think in general terms, it's a pretty effective mechanism. However, I have concerns about new entrants and the impact of new entrants, and making sure that we get real reductions. So that is why I'm putting forward an amendment that says that to legislate that the safeguard mechanism actually drives down to the targeted emissions for these companies. Because if you get lots of new entrants, the danger is the new entrants could counter a lot of the reductions made by the rest of the companies covered in the safeguard mechanism. And some modelling recently suggests that the mechanism may not meet its own targets. So I think it's absolutely critical that we do make sure we meet those targets. And so I put forward a sort of emission ceiling amendment in relation to that. And then I think the other concern, and I think the other bone of contention, I think both for the Greens and for the crossbench, is the unlimited use of offsets. And I think this is there is definitely, and there should be a role for offsets in reaching, in reaching our climate targets, particularly in the early days, as it takes time for companies to get up the sort of emissions reductions curve and put in place emissions reductions behaviours, which do take time. And so I think it's appropriate for their use, particularly at the start, and also for some facilities where we do not yet have the technology to completely remove emissions, in, say, from cement or ammonia or other areas of sort of big major industrial facilities. There's also a role for offsets in that environment as well. But the concern, I think, from me and others in the crossbench and the Greens is that, you know, there's an overuse of offsets is potential. There's an unlimited use of offsets. And we want to, you know, I'm very passionate that we should have very strong incentives for companies to both invest in actual reduction of emissions, but also that, you know, those innovators, those people who are developing the technology to reduce emissions in those sort of hard to sort of reduce emissions sectors, that, you know, they can have strong incentives to develop those technologies that that the companies can then adopt. So so to sort of do that, Zali has put forward a sort of amendment sort of relating to that, and I have also put forward an amendment which is about making the removing a cap on the cost of offsets that people can you know pay, because again, I want, you know, if I want companies to face the full cost of their carbon, because if big polluters face the full cost of their carbon, then they will take the action to reduce those costs and reduce their emissions. So those will give you a bit of a sense of you know, the positions to date and you know, the sort of conflicting positions, I think, in Parliament. I've jumped into some of the detail here, but I will take a bit step back on the use of carbon credits. And so, Tim, you know, what do you want to just explain sort of how offsets used in the safeguard mechanism, and, you know, what do you think the potential issues are with it?
Yes, the offsets are certainly proving to be a very controversial area. We know that historically the Australian Carbon Credit Unit, the ACCU, the methods have been called out. The Professor McIntosh has talked about virtual fraud in some of the historic movements. We've had Professor Chubb's review, and I think an absolute key part of the safeguard mechanism is the implementation of all of Professor Chubb's panel review recommendations. And the good news is Minister Bowen has said he will do that. And so it's all about trying to restore integrity in the process. I am, at the end of the day, 100% ACCU offsets is problematic, but at the end of the day, what I don't want to see is where we do let perfect get in the way of progress. We've got to have progress. And I come from a finance background. I'm not a climate or carbon analyst. I'm a finance analyst. I know a high price on carbon, a high and rising regulated price on carbon, is absolutely key to unlocking the finance at the scale and the speed that we need to drive the permanent reduction of emissions in our economy and seize the enormous global opportunities that are in front of us. So at the end of the day, to me, one of the core objectives is getting a high price on carbon and getting it rising over time. So as Allegra mentioned, there is a cap at the moment proposed of $75 a tonne, and it rises with inflation plus 2% per annum. That is still way below where the EU ETS, the emissions trading scheme in Europe, is. It's way below where the IEA says the carbon price has to go, but it has to rise. And at the end of the day, we need a price on carbon. We've had climate wars for a decade. We need a price on carbon. Finance can do a hell of a lot. I believe it can solve the climate crisis, but only if we have the right price on carbon. So as Allegra mentioned, the idea of introducing unlimited offsets is problematic. Zali's bill does suggest capping that at 90% offsets and then reducing 10% per year. That does allow the lagging industries who have failed to prepare some time, and I have some sympathy for that, but I also would note that the European Union has been working on a very effective carbon policy for 20 years. All of Australian firms know that they have to deal with this. They know they've been given 20 years of get out of jail free, pollute all you like with no consequences. So they should have prepared. They know what the science is and they should have prepared. So I think we need action. We need to make sure there's real action. What I like is a high price on carbon and a reduction of 7 million tonnes per annum, 5.8% compound over the next 7 years. That will drive tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars of investment because it's the commercial outcome they need. So offsets are there. There are opportunities. We need the price on carbon, as Allegra said, to actually incentivize development of new technologies. And maybe we'll come back to that a bit later.
Mm-hmm. I think there's a good, just wanted to sort of make the point on the unlimited use of offset, and, I probably approach this quite through a finance background, finance kind of perspective as well. I want strong incentives, and a high price of carbon is going to be the best driver of, is going to be the best driver of action, because companies will make financially rational decisions, and if it's expensive, and then they will invest, and that's what we absolutely need them to do. In terms of the unlimited use of offsets, I do have concerns on, and Australia would be an outlier to have the unlimited use of offsets. So I think a number of people have said Kazakhstan's the only other country in the world that uses unlimited use of offsets. All sort of other major developed economies have some sort of limits on the use of offsets. Some don't allow any at all. So I think that we're in good company if we consider how to limit the use of offsets. This is going to be, though I'll be honest, I think this is going to be a tough area of negotiation with the government. I think the government, accepts the principle of, the goal is to, firstly, abate the emissions. Secondly, if you can't do that, use the offsets that are created within the safeguard mechanism. And the third best is the use of ACCUs, the sort of general offsets that are created in the broader economy. But it's how you put that sort of in sort of the legislation, I think, is some of the challenge, or legislation or the regulation. I might come to your next question. So to you, Tim, do polluters need to demonstrate they have a plan for reducing emissions or achieving net zero before they can access carbon credits?
Yeah, that's not explicit in the in this initiative, but I'll go back to my earlier reference that this is one key initiative in Australia of a suite of initiatives, and it's great to see the expanding suite of initiatives, but Australia is not in isolation. So the idea that Australian firms are just going to offset everything, they're just going to bear the cost and do absolutely nothing, it ignores the fact that there is global momentum. And let me give one example of that. The Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero manages collectively $150 trillion of capital. All of their members have pledged to net zero alignment. They've all pledged to interim targets, and they're all ratcheting up their ambition and their demands on companies, and that they are all major shareholders in the Australian major companies. So the idea that Australian companies are only going to respond to the safeguard mechanism ignores the fact that there is actually a global momentum that's accelerating phenomenally, not the least being that every listed company in Australia needs to have a net zero emissions plan, scope 1, 2, and 3. They've got to have credible targets, and their boards and their CEO and their chairs are going to be held to account by their major global shareholders if they don't deliver on that. So in the context of the safeguard mechanism, there is no requirement at the moment. And as Allegra said, we need to be wary of pushing for perfection here on a point where at the moment, Chris Bowen's not showing a lot of movement, but at the end of the day, let's get a price in, let's get the policy in, and we can always ratchet up. There is a review in 2 years' time, and obviously there'll be a federal election by then, so they'll have hopefully a far greater mandate to lift the aspiration more in line with what the climate science is. But let me just say, I'm not ignoring the climate science. We know that Australia's 43% is not science aligned, but I'll have to say it's a hell of a lot better than it was a year ago. So we're making pretty good progress. So let's get towards science alignment as we progress.
Exactly. There's a question we've received about, given the concerns, the integrity concerns of, logging in rainforests, and questions over whether Australian carbon credit unions, ACCUs, represent genuine additional abatement. How much faith that we have that the new SGM, the safeguard mechanism, carbon credits, will actually draw down carbon? And so, you know, I feel pretty positive about that, I'll be honest. So, you know, for those people, there will be carbon SGM, the sort of safeguard mechanism carbon credits. So those carbon credits for the companies covered by the safeguard mechanism. And those, if the companies, you know, over deliver in an abatement, they'll have sort of effectively offsets they generate from within the safeguard mechanism that could also be traded. You know, I think that I think the Chubb review was an effective review, and I think is moving, I think, Australia positively in terms of the direction in terms of the recommendations that they made. I think you know, recommendations that improve and significantly improve the integrity of our carbon you know, of our carbon markets. And I think similarly in relation to these companies, because it's a narrower group of companies, I feel, you know, I think I do have much more confidence that the safeguard mechanism carbon credits will be an important and pretty rigorous you know, set of carbon credits. But our job really is to absolutely monitor these, you know, very, very closely, and, you know, to hold the companies to account who had to make these reductions. Just a question now, moving on to new entrants to the safeguard mechanism. Question is for you, Tim. How are new entrants treated in the safeguard mechanism, and who might the new entrants be?
Yes, and that's a little bit of an unknown, and that's where there is risk and why it's really important we cap the total emissions and we reduce them progressively. It's got to be real emissions reduction. New additions are all part of the economy continuing to grow. I'll maybe give an example of some work I've been doing recently. Lithium. Lithium to me is a critical opportunity for Australia to change the narrative. We've been talking at Climate Energy Finance about the whole massive opportunity in critical minerals. Now, let's take lithium. Australia last year exported half the world's lithium. And the price has also gone up 500, 600%. And so the profitability of the sector has been huge. So there is and we know that demand for lithium for electric vehicle batteries, for example, is going to double and then double again. So Australia's in the absolute box seat. But one maybe little unknown fact about lithium is we export lithium hard rock, or lithium spodumene is what it's called. Now that can have 1 to 6% lithium, meaning it can have up to 99% waste product in there. So Australia at the moment is building 3 of the 3 largest new lithium refineries outside of China in the world. So all in Western Australia, 2 of them are actually in commissioning right now. And so lithium hydroxide will become the export. All the waste will be removed before we export it. Now, each of those 3 facilities are 3 of the largest in the world, and they will all exceed 100,000 tonnes of carbon emissions per annum per facility. So each of them will be new entrants to the safeguard mechanism. And now, assuming they aren't actually retrofitted, for example, with renewable energy power, and they actually start responding to the safeguard mechanism impulse that they'll be facing now. They didn't have any carbon emissions barriers when the projects were being built, designed and funded, and so therefore they will each be new entrants into the market. Now, I see the opportunity for Australia to export embodied decarbonisation. I mean, that can be an absolutely huge $100 billion a year export opportunity for Australia. We can help our trade partners decarbonise their economies. We can deal with the single global atmosphere that we're talking about, but in terms of domestic scope 1 emissions, it will increase Australia's emissions, everything else being equal. So the scheme is designed to take that expansion and economic growth and increased value add into account and to accommodate it. Now, it does encourage or enshrine industry best practice. That's an area where I think we need to see a huge amount of transparency and work done to make sure there is total integrity across the board, total transparency, and every new entrant has to apply absolute best practice. And I would, as part of that, sorry to digress for a second, I would say we absolutely need per site monitoring, real-time, transparent, public disclosure of that monitoring of all the emissions of these facilities so that we can watch them. There are going to be satellites that think tanks are funding right now to actually do it, regardless of whether the firms allow us to or not. But I think as a core part of the reform, transparency and integrity is key. So at the end of the day, long-winded answer to say that's examples of new entrants. Obviously, the one that Adam Band and the Greens have been really smashing the safeguard mechanism about is all the new oil, gas and coal entrants. They are huge methane emitters in particular, they're huge emissions. So that is obviously a problem. And I think we need to, though, focus on scope 1 rather than oil, gas and coal separately, deal with them in a separate equation rather than using the safeguard mechanism as a bludgeon to deal with scope 3. It's all about scope 1 here. Let's solve for scope 1 and then separately deal with the elephant in the room, scope 3.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for that. Just to respond to a question in the chat, which I think is relevant before I sort of talk more about new entrants, was also to say that just to come back to the use of offsets, currently the safeguard mechanism doesn't include use of international offsets, and I think that's absolutely correct. And we should be, I think it contemplates, considering that over time, but right now I think it's absolutely critical that we get the integrity of our offsets right, use them, get our offset market really working, and then, and over time, consider how to make sure that you've got high integrity offsets if you're ever going to use international offsets. In terms of...
Sorry, Allegra.
Yeah?
Can I jump in on that? I might maybe just not push back, but put a different perspective in. I actually like the idea of international offsets where you look at what Chris Bowen has actually said. Let's go, if the EU emissions trading scheme was willing to consider fungibility with our scheme, that would imply a massive lift in the integrity of our ACCUs, a massive lift. We'd have to deliver, as Allegra just said, a massive improvement in where we've been even a year ago, let alone 5 years ago. And so the idea of going to world's best practice and having the EU invite Australia in to work with them and to merge with their scheme gets me really excited, because it bakes in integrity. And then secondly, the whole debate at the moment is Chris Bowen's changed the discussion from a $30 to $40 ACCU price to a cap of $75 a tonne, and Allegra's challenging even that. The EU ETS is sitting up at $120, $150 Aussie a tonne. So the idea of moving in alignment with the EU ETS would imply carbon prices double again. I'm all for that, because you double the price on carbon, firms will amazingly find all sorts of technologies that just weren't commercially viable until the safeguard mechanism legislation comes into force, and then all of a sudden they will find that the solutions are viable and they will implement them. The higher the price, the faster they'll implement them. So if we do what Minister Bowen has talked about, tying to the best systems in the world, tying to the integrity and transparency of the best system in the world, I'm all for that. But let's get our own backyard cleaned up first, as Allegra said.
And Tim, I'd agree with you on that. I think there's a concern of the sort of unregulated, unmonitored, sort of sham offsets in some parts of the world, but I 100% agree with you in relation to the EU. So it is exactly right, moving sort of within that. So just a question, the Greens are asking the government to legislate a ban on new coal and gas projects in return for their support on the safeguard mechanism. And, what's my view on that? I don't want to see any new coal and gas or oil projects in Australia or actually around the world. I genuinely think we need to find our way through this without that, and that's based on the sort of international best view in terms of what do we need to achieve net zero. We need to stop new coal, gas, and oil. That said, I've been consistent to say I don't support a ban on this one. I think that the safeguard mechanism is absolutely critical to pass, and we should, whatever your view is, on new coal and gas, no one should stand in the way of this going through Parliament and this going up and running, because this will make an immediate difference to big businesses' practices in reducing emissions. So, I very much support the safeguard mechanism, in its current form, even though I'd like to see improvements to it. In terms of, in general terms, I have, not said, so far I've not said, I want a complete ban on new oil, coal or gas. And my approach on that is not because I want to see any more, but because I don't think bans, flat bans is an effective model. We do have to consider, what happens over time. And I just think a blanket ban is not the way to go, but I don't want to see any new coal, oil and gas. And what I think we need to do as a country is plan for that. And, we've just got the EMO's just come out today with its plan, which suggests there are some gaps in gas production coming up in the few years. We need to work out how to avoid needing to bring new gas supply on to meet those demands. We need to make sure that we've got the renewables and the firming to deal with that, as well as demand management and demand smoothing to deal with that. Those are the critical paths that we need to take so that those potential gaps in supply do not eventuate. I think I'll just move on to emissions projections and broader decarbonisation plans. So, one of the questions was, modelling was released last week that showed there was little room for error in meeting the safeguard targets. What did this modelling show and what are the implications? And this was the Reputex modelling that came out at the beginning of last week. This was modelling that said that if Australia, if the government did approve, I think it was 16 new coal, oil and gas projects, which are, many of those are slated and fairly far way along in terms of their approvals. If those were all approved, the danger is that the safeguard mechanism would not deliver its emissions reductions budget. This is the reason I raised this with the minister, and that is the reason why I have put forward the amendment I have to make sure that that the safeguard mechanism is directed around ensuring that we actually find and deliver that reduction in industrial emissions. So, I think the minister's view is that it's unlikely all these projects are going to come off. He feels confident that it's an unlikely scenario that they won't meet it, those goals. But I still think that is that certainty and that clarity is what we need in the legislation. Then just in terms of sort of other questions, I'm going to sort of jump now to some more sort of questions, to kind of broader decarbonisation plans. Where I think, when you look at Australia's decarbonisation approach, we've got the electricity sector, which has been doing the heavy lifting to date on decarbonisation and is continue to expect to do that. And, in general terms is making, I think, really good strides. To deliver on the electricity sector, we need to deliver the plan on actually building the poles and wires, as well as the storage and renewable energy to deliver those at the sort of the grid level reductions in carbon. But that's, there's strong plans there. It's now actually about delivering them. You look at industrial emissions, the safeguard mechanism is the major driver for industrial emissions. You look at transport emissions. This has been an area where the government, I think, took a very weak policy into the election. And this is an area where I think, myself and others on the crossbench have been working, I think, and sort of lobbying the government very hard, and so have many people across the sector, to increase their ambition on transport, particularly in relation to electric vehicles and putting in fuel efficiency standards. I think this is one of the lowest hanging fruits of climate policy that we should absolutely see. And I feel encouraged that the government is going to get there, but it's certainly one that we need to absolutely keep the pressure on. And then the other sector I think it's really important is to note is on domestic emissions. However, we talk a lot about the electricity, sort of the grid level reduction, but there's much more that can be done on the household level. And I think that is both important from a point of view of decarbonisation, but it's also important from a point of view of cost of living. If we can help people, permanently lower their electricity bills, through the use of solar, through the use of the sort of electrification of their house, sort of adoption of heat pumps, all those things, I think actually inoculate ourselves against the sort of coalitions, sort of rhetoric that we're paying more for electricity because of we're paying more for electricity because of sort of clean energy. The coalition's absolutely wrong. We're paying more for electricity because we've got a war in the Ukraine, which has driven up fossil fuel prices. But still, that is the rhetoric that they, will potentially take to the next election. And I think our greatest inoculation of that, and also to help households who are genuinely struggling, is to invest further in household electrification, particularly for renters, for low-income families, for strata building. So that is a piece of work that we're really driving, and we'll be again working with the government on, as well as working with the broader sector on how can we really accelerate the household electrification pathway. And then lastly, there are areas like agriculture where to date we have not had as much on the technology front as we need to see a good path to reduction in emissions, particularly of methane. However, I just met a company today who's doing, and so it's called what was the name again? Sorry, Tim, you meant, I've got the Sea Forest. Have a Google of them if you haven't, if you've not heard of them. They're based out of Tasmania. They are basically, they're working through sort of technology developed through the CSIRO. They are growing a type of seaweed that can be fed to cows to significantly reduce their methane emissions between 70 and 98%. So absolutely incredible through the addition of a small amount of their product into feedstock. It's an Australian world-leading technology, but we need to get all the policy settings right so that they can actually really take off. So that's a pretty exciting technology that could really support the agricultural sector's decarbonisation. But they're actually waiting on how the carbon credits market evolves to be able to really sort of fast forward their business model. So I think that's I kind of a bit more of a sense of where I think the market is going, and I think it's also why it's so important that Australia moves pretty quickly in relation to all these different pieces. I'm then going to just follow up with another couple of questions, and then I think we'll go to questions from the floor. Question from John. Do you think our political leaders have managed the process well so far? They seem to have missed reliability. What's the total amount of subsidies provided so far? Do you think this has been fair cost to war? Should we have an honest debate about nuclear? And are we being hypocritical in exporting uranium? I think that in broad terms, the politics of decarbonisation has been managed incredibly badly over the last 20, 30 years. But that said, I think we are doing much better at the moment. And I think this last, I think the government in many ways has managed the politics pretty well, though I don't think their ambition has been strong enough. And I think that's part of the role of the crossbench. I think in terms of should we have an honest debate about nuclear? Look, I think I've always been open to nuclear as a technology for decarbonisation. I think there are parts of the world where it's a really important technology for decarbonisation. However, because Australia's sun, and we have some of the best sun and wind assets in the world, a solar panel here can create 2 to 3 times more electricity than it can in many other places in the world, that we actually don't need nuclear in the way that other countries do need it. And it's actually much cheaper for us not to use nuclear, but to use renewable plus firming. The CSIRO has done the studies on this, and that's what I constantly come back to when people come back on nuclear, because it's very expensive. It takes a very long time to build. And the models, that sort of small nuclear reactor models that people are talking about, are still generally unproven and completely over budget whenever people do buy field nuclear, as they are finding in the UK. So I think that we should work on the technology that we know that we've got right in front of us, which is the solar and wind plus firming, and really deliver that. To Tim, the US recently announced nearly $600 billion in subsidies and incentives to support clean energy investment. Where are the incentives for Australia where are the incentives to push Australia towards decarbonisation and a clean energy future? And is Australia at risk of falling behind if foreign investment skills and technology are already moving to the US? That's a great question.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'm actually going to be looking tonight for the EU to actually announce their formal response to the US Inflation Reduction Act. So the EU has flagged that they're really worried about outflows of investment and corporates in Europe across to America because the magnitude of the subsidies being offered, incentives to deploy in America at an unbelievable scale. Like, this is the single largest subsidy investment program in world history, the Inflation Reduction Act, when you combine it with the Department of Energy's Home Office loan program, which is another $400 billion incentive. So that's like the CEFC, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, but 30 times bigger than the CFC. So America's unlocked this massive, massive stimulus to drive onshore manufacturing. We have just seen Korea talk about a massive response to that because they don't want to lose all the manufacturing jobs. So the Korean government's now working with Korean industry. In December, we saw the Japanese government announce the GX roadmap, a $20 trillion subsidy for decarbonization of Japanese industry. And then coming back to my comment tonight, we get, it's been delayed 2 days, but the EU will be announcing the Net Zero Industries Act, I expect tonight, and it's all about putting in massive incentives and doubling the number of subsidies and incentives that Europe is paying its industries to onshore manufacturing supply chains and build out capacity at record high levels. So that will see Europe join with America, join with Japan, join with Korea, join with India. And India's got its own PLI scheme to incentivize manufacturing in India. And then the Chinese alone are also the world's biggest investor. So don't forget the Chinese 5-year plan is by far the world leader in investing in every new technology. So I'm really excited. The safeguard mechanism's coming at a time when the world's ambition is just accelerating at an unbelievable rate. So yeah, you'll probably see my note tomorrow about the nature of what Europe announces. Hopefully they'll get it through, but they've been leaking a number of the policy initiatives, and it looks like Europe is going to be doubling down yet again, having been the world leader, doubling down to match American ambition, to match Chinese ambition. To me, that is perfect. We now have a global race to drive the energy transition at the speed the science dictates. And so that, to me, becomes a critical pushback on the argument, oh, Australia's just going to go and build all sorts of new oil, gas and coal. They might. Our industry, if we don't put constraints on them, might do it. But are they going to get financing from global investors to do it? Well, I'd refer you back to the Energy Transmission Commission's report that was released last week, sponsored by Woodside and Santos, ironically, that forecast LNG demand is going to drop by 3/4 in the next 17 years. Now, if Woodside reads their own research that they published, they commissioned, they published it, no one asked them to do it, but if you're going to invest in line with the science, LNG demand globally is going to drop by 3/4, according to Woodside's own analysis, in the next 17 years. I don't think Woodside's going to be going and deploying tens of billions of dollars building more capacity if global demand's collapsing. So I am full of excitement. I think the opportunity for Australia is once in a century, and the US Inflation Reduction Act is America's attempt to get back in the race against China. And that's great because we need a race to all of these technologies and deployment at the scale and speed that the science dictates.
Mm-hmm. And to come to the second half of that question, and I 100% agree with you, Tim. From a global planetary point of view, this is exactly what we need. Leadership from major countries and a sort of arms race effectively on decarbonisation, which is what I think has been kicked off. I guess the question is, there's a very good question though. What should Australia's response be on this? We are talking about the safeguard mechanism. We're talking about a bunch of domestic pieces, but are there should we go further?
Yeah, sorry. Thanks for reminding me. That's a key question. And we have seen Dr. Professor Alan Finkel, respond with a report to the federal government articulating what he and a committee think Australia should do. That's not been made public, but it's worth bearing that in mind. The government is very, very aware. If Australia does nothing, if we go back to the traditional trite response, let's just leave it to the free market, we've got to be kidding ourselves, because Europe's not leaving it to the free market, Japan's not leaving it to the free market, Korea, China, and America aren't leaving it to the free market. We need a response. We need a response that is going to be enormous, in my view. It needs to be enormous. The opportunity is enormous. We've actually articulated through the Climate Capital Forum blueprint a paper arguing how the government needs to create the right incentives, financial incentives, public capital to lead the way to crowd in massive private capital, because we can't match America dollar for dollar. But what we do have is the world's fourth largest superannuation pool in the world, $3.4 trillion. I'm not saying what we need to do is have the government create the right framework so that pool of investors wants to invest in decarbonisation. So the government needs to lead. We need the public financial institutions to create the right framework to crowd in private capital. And yeah, I'm pretty sure we will see a response from the Albanese government. They haven't been too clear on what their response will be, but I know they've taken Dr. Finkel's report with a huge amount of interest, and they're just working it through. It'll probably start to be evident in the May budget, which Jim Chalmers will be releasing.
Thank you. Like, we're coming to the last of our time for the questions. You know, what will the compromise be reached for the safeguard mechanism reforms to be passed? And how can the Labor government be convinced that voters will not tolerate a government which doesn't commit to do what's right in relation to new oil or coal and gas projects? I think in terms of, I feel cautiously optimistic on the safeguard mechanism. I think it will go through Parliament. I do think that people want to be on the right side of history for this. So I think it will be passed. How can the Labor government increase its ambition? I think that's it's a very it's a good question. It's actually about people power. You know, I think the international context is really important, and so the more that there's global commitment, the more that Australia is in good company. But I think it's got to be continually the people power, the power of votes, but the power of, writing to MPs, making your voices heard, I think is what will convince the Labor government to go further. I also think that it is about, minimising the chance of backlash. So I think that what the government also, from a policy response point of view, needs to do is make sure, one, that we work with households to make sure that they don't, from a cost of living point of view, they get the benefit of cheap energy or the cheap renewable energy that Australia has. But secondly, also that the communities that are most affected by closing coal and gas, have a pathway to prosperity and continued jobs. And that's got to be, I think that's the job of government, but that's also the job of the community to stand up for and continually to advocate and write to. And so I always, in all meetings, I always say, write to your MP. I know I am the MP for most of you guys, for many people on this call, so you can write to me, but also write to the ministers about this, because the more correspondence that people get, and the more that's not just a copy and paste from a campaign email, but is actually an email that gives you a bit of a sense of a person and where they're coming from and why it's important to them, the more notice that will be had. So please, I always encourage people to do that, because I think most politicians just want to try and do what's popular. And I think that we need to show that taking real action on climate change is absolutely popular in our communities. And last question for Tim. The fear is that power blackouts will become more frequent, longer lasting and more widespread. How are renewables going to fully replace fossil fuels as baseload power providers?
Yeah, that's to me, baseload power is the concept of last century and last decade. At the end of the day, what we know is when it is sunny, sunny is once built, solar is a zero marginal cost of production. When it's windy, wind has a zero marginal cost of production. So what we need is actually firming power. We don't need baseload power. Excuse my cat, she's lacking attention. So we need we definitely don't need baseload power, because baseload power is actually proving really problematic. You own a coal-fired power plant and you want to run it, you will actually have to pay for the privilege of doing that in today's grid, because the power price will be negative most days when it's sunny, and it'll be negative like it is in England today. When it's windy, the power price goes negative. So you're running a coal-fired power plant, not only will you have a negative revenue number because the power price can go to minus $1,000 a megawatt hour, you'll then have to pay for the coal that you're using. So you'll actually lose money hand over fist. Baseload power is the wrong concept. It's about peaking power and demand response management so that we can leverage the ever lower cost of wind and solar with firmed renewables, firmed power. So we've just seen today, Western Australia announced one of the biggest batteries in the world. That's the Western Australian Synergy. They've just committed to doing a huge battery, which like 5 times, 6 times, 7 times bigger than the Tesla big battery that was built in South Australia only 5 years ago. Okay, 5 years is a long time in energy these days, but 6 times bigger than the biggest battery in the world 5 years ago. And by the way, that's only one of 200 battery proposals. 130 gigawatt hours of battery proposals are on the drawing board. There is just, Australia has actually got the second largest number of batteries proposals in the world. So let's think about firming in the form of vehicle to grid, pumped hydro storage, using our existing gas peakers, using demand response management, and using batteries, and using interstate grid transmission. It's about modernizing the grid, using virtual power plants. It's all about actually using technology and using the least cost solution for all consumers. So that to me is really exciting, because the opportunities are enormous to drive costs down permanently. And you can build a battery, a utility scale battery, in about a year. You try and build the Narrabri gas field, it'll take 5 years to build the facility and the pipeline, and then you'll have lock-in for 40 years beyond that. It's just a ludicrous idea. What we need to do is deploy solutions that are cost-effective for consumers, look at what investors are willing to invest in, and the investors in Australia, the private investors in Australia, are lined up categorically to invest in more wind, more solar, and more batteries, and more electric vehicles. So that's the future, that's the opportunity.
I hear you. There has been a lot, I'm conscious it's 9 o'clock now. There's been a lot of discussion on the chat, but I can also see that Joe's thankfully been responding to a lot of comments on that. Joe and Kath, are there any comments or any questions that we should just do from a wrap point of view that we feel weren't covered off here?
I think hopefully we've managed to answer most of them either in the discussion or via the chat. I think if people haven't felt that they've got an answer to their question, I'll pop Allegra's email in the chat, and we can make sure we get back to you in the next few days.
Cool. Thank you. I just want to say a huge thank you, Tim. I always learn something when I talk to you, and very grateful to be able to work and learn from you, and all the work that you're doing in this space, and your deep understanding of the sector. So thank you very much, Tim, for being part of this. And thank you everybody for joining. I know it's a pretty technical area. It's an area, but it's, I think, an area that is really important, and I'm just really grateful for everyone to joining. If you've got any questions or comments after this, any other areas where you think that we should be focused on in relation particularly to the safeguard mechanism that's going to be in front of Parliament, please let me know. But otherwise, just keep talking and keep sharing your views and your perspectives, and what you think we should be thinking about, because that's what we're trying to do, is lead from the community and lead and listen to the experts, and that's the approach we're taking. So thanks everyone, and thanks Kath particularly for the concept for tonight and bringing it all together. Really appreciate it, and Joe for so much answering of questions in the chat. It was like there was a separate Zoom going on just on chat. Night everybody.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone.
Good night.
Good
Thank
night.
you.
Is Tim still on?